Order the Finance Committee for May 4th. The only item we have on the agenda is the General Fund Fiscal Year 2017 budget. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So yeah, this is part of the fiscal year 2017 recommended budget, and this is the first of there's a series of presentations to the committee, and this is something we do every year. We bring to you a more detailed discussion of our major revenues and the assumptions that we make for this year and for next year. And then we also we piggyback on that. You're looking at one more year out. What's, on a multi-year forecast basis, what does it look like this year, next year, and then year 2018? And we do that just to see if there are any unusual trends that might pop up, if we're on the right trajectory or not. So we'll be looking at a multi-year forecast. I want to just start by saying that for us, the revenue piece is super important. I mean, it really establishes how much money you have to spend the next year. So we put a lot of time and effort into developing these. We don't just wag these because they're important to make sure we know what we're going to get and not overestimate or underestimate. And we spend a lot of time with that, and you'll hear Julie mention, Ms. Nemes mentioned that, referred to sort of various sources of data that we rely on. We just don't look at trends, although that's a big part of it. We look at economic factors, economic data. We have consultants that assist us in developing those estimates. So it's a pretty long process. It takes us several months, and we're always updating as new information comes in. And so anyway, I want to make sure you understood it. This is an important part of what we do. And we're here to primarily kind of show you what we're projecting, but also to get your input to see if you feel like we are being too aggressive, too conservative. There's always that fine balance, because if we are too conservative, then we potentially are missing out on opportunities to add services, to spend more on capital, whatever. And conversely, if we're too aggressive and we miss the mark, then we have problems as well. Then we're looking at using reserves that we didn't really plan on. And I think these days, since the recession, we have been a lot more conservative than we have in the past. When I was first here in the late 90s, when things were growing great, we were very conservative. We could afford to be, and it created these huge surpluses at the end of the year that we used to fund capital the following year. We try to be a lot more precise in our estimates, in large part because we don't have reserves of a policy anymore. So if we're off, we're going to be impacting reserves. So we are more precise. In fact, we've added that anticipated year and variance number to even become more precise on the expenditure side, what we expect to see in savings. So anyway, with that introduction, I want to turn over to Ms. Nemes. She's the one that really does a lot of the work along with her staff in developing these estimates, and she'll go over those, and then I'll take over and just look at the multi-year forecast. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nemes.
Good afternoon, Chair Hart, committee members. I am Julie Nemes, the Treasury Manager for the Finance Department. Today I'll be focusing on the general fund major revenues, and then I will pass it on to Mr. Samario to go over the multi-year forecast. I'm going to be focusing on several different areas. At first, I will go over a summary of the non-departmental major revenue sources. Then I'll be going into some detail on all of those major revenue sources. I'll be looking at sales tax, property tax, transient occupancy tax, utility users tax, franchise fees, business license, and finally property transfer tax. And as Mr. Samario mentioned, I'll be going over what our assumptions are, and I'll be looking for any input you have on those assumptions that we've made for FY17. So first of all, as I mentioned, this is a summary of the non-departmental major revenues. And I'm going to go over a little bit what each of these columns are. The first in yellow is the FY15 actuals. In orange is the FY16 current year adopted budget, our revised projection, and then the variance between the adopted budget and our revised projection. In green is the FY17 originally proposed budget, the revised projection, and the variance between the originally proposed budget and the revised projection. At the bottom, you'll see in purple, those are the totals. And what I wanted to point out here, this is a summary of all of our revenues, and most of our revenues are getting a little soft in FY16. The one exception to that is property taxes. It's performing quite well in FY16, and we're extending that out to FY17. But in total, the majority of our revenues have gotten a little soft in FY16. So you'll look overall at the bottom at that purple row, and you'll see that for FY16, based on current data that we have, with our revised projections, we're showing that revenues for the FY16, the revised projection compared to adopted budget, are showing a decline in revenues of about $1.9 million. For FY17, the revised projection compared to the original proposed budget shows a decrease in revenues of about $2.5 million, and I'll circle those for you real quick. So those are the two numbers that are changing based on current data that we have and our revised projections. So now I'm going to go into detail for each of those major revenue sources and show what has changed since we made the original two-year plan and what our new assumptions are. So first of all, for sales tax. Sales tax is received quarterly, and it is received 1 quarter in arrears. So when we created our FY17 forecast, we had 2 quarters of data for FY16, and that meant the data was through December 2015. So the first 2 quarters of FY16 did come in lower than what we had adopted for FY16. The first quarter was a negative about 3% growth, and the second quarter was 2%. We did have some one-time adjustments to that first quarter, but they both did come in below the adopted growth rate, which was 4.5%. So we reduced the growth rate for the rest of FY16 from 4.5% to 2%. This resulted in projected revenue decrease of $1.2 million from adopted budget for FY16. For FY17, we reduced the growth rate from 4.5% to 3%. We didn't reduce it further because we do think that inflation, which has been hovering around 1%, is going to go up a little bit. We're seeing that we think that gas prices have finally leveled off. And we think that we also got some recommendation from our sales tax consultant, which is consistent with that 3%. So that was one of the external data sources that Mr. Samario was mentioning. So based on the lower base from FY16, which carries over to FY17, and a revised growth rate for FY17, this results in a revised revenue forecast of $1.7 million below the original FY17 proposed budget. So this is a summary of the sales tax revenues. Once again, the yellow is the FY15 actual results. It also has a column for actual growth rate. The FY16 is in orange, and that has the adopted budget, the reforecast, and the revised growth rate. And the green is the FY17 budget, which is the reforecast and the revised growth. You'll see at the bottom in the dark green color, there's a variance of the reforecast compared to adopted budget and proposed budget for FY16 and FY17, as well as the original adopted growth rates. The other thing I wanted to point out is the shaded blue color is a budgeted numbers versus the white is actual numbers. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, you'll see those first 2 quarters are actual results, which show the negative 3.4% in FY16 for the first quarter. That's the growth rate, and 2.1% for the second quarter in FY16. And we have put in the change in the growth rate for the next 2 quarters of 2%, which results in an annualized growth rate for FY16 of 0.9%. That for FY16 results in a loss of revenues compared to adopted budget of $1.2 million. For FY17, we have changed the growth rate from 4.5% to 3%, which results in a loss of revenues compared to the original proposed budget of $1.6 million. Any questions on sales tax before I move on? All right. So I also wanted to provide a little historical review of sales tax revenues, 2011 compared to 2017. The orange is actual results, and the green is our forecasted results. So in 2011, we had $17.6 million in sales tax revenues, and in 2017, we're projecting $22.4 million in sales tax revenues. This also represents, at the very top, you'll see in the percentage, those are the growth rates. So what you'll see is that between 2011 and 2017, we had $4.8 million increase in sales tax revenues, which is about a 27% growth. And growth rates have changed anywhere from 0.8% in 2016 to 8.8% in 2012. Between 2011 and 2015, the average growth was about 5.2%. So what we're seeing here is that historically sales tax has grown around 5%, but it is leveling off in 2016 and 2017, which is consistent with what we're seeing in the economy. We're seeing low inflation. We're seeing a decrease in new auto car sales. Gas prices have been low. So it is consistent with what we're seeing. We're hoping, we think inflation will pick up a little bit next year, which is why we're going with a 3% rate. But it is lower for 2016. Moving on to property taxes, this is our major revenue source that is doing quite well. Over the last several years, property taxes have performed quite well. Our revised projection is based on a county valuation report that we received for 2016 with a assessed value increase of 6.6%. So that is factored into the fiscal year 16 results. Our projected revenue increase is $665,000 compared to adopted budget in fiscal year 2016. For fiscal year 17, we are recommending no change in the growth rate, and that is based on current data we've received. Also, our property tax consultant has confirmed they recommend a 5% increase as well, so we are not recommending any change. There are additional property taxes above and beyond secured and unsecured, but we are recommending no change to those for 16 or 17 because those are very difficult to estimate. So we are recommending to change those, to not change those. Due to the higher base from FY16, it does impact the revenues for FY17. So the revised revenue forecast results in a $982,000 increase in FY17 compared to the original proposed budget. I also wanted to point out that we are assuming a modest Proposition 8 recapture. This is consistent with what we've seen from the assessor's office over the last several years. They have not moved to recapture all Prop 8 properties all in 1 year. They've taken a several-year approach, so we're assuming the same thing for next year. Once again, this is similar to the other chart I presented for sales tax. This is property tax revenues. You'll see the 6.6% revised growth for FY16, which results in a $665,000 variance compared to adopted budget for FY16. For FY17, due to the higher base, even though we haven't changed the growth rate, it does result in close to $1 million of additional revenues compared to the proposed budget for FY17. Sure. Mr. Samario suggested that I discuss the individual components. So property taxes, that top line, the 6.6, that is the assessed values that we get from the assessor's office. Those are the secured and unsecured, primarily secured and unsecured property values. We also get additional property taxes related to aircraft, interest, supplemental. Aircraft is related to aircraft that are within the city limits. Those are, as I mentioned, very hard to estimate. So we use an average or we use the prior year. In this case, we are reforecasting based on prior year actuals. And the supplemental is based on when property changes in the year. We get additional supplemental taxes when property changes in the year. So once again, those are very, very hard to estimate. So. Oh, sorry, it was delayed a little bit. Once again, a look at historical property taxes. These are from 2011 through 2017, a look at historical property tax growth rates as well as actual revenues. That once again, orange is actuals and green is a forecast. In 2011, we received $22.8 million in property taxes, and in 2017, we received $29 million. The difference between 2011 and 2017 was about $6.2 million, which represented 27%, very similar to sales tax. And between 2011 and 2015, the average growth was about 2.5%. What I wanted to point out was that several years ago, back during the recession, the growth was even negative. It was negative 1.1%. But over the last several years, property taxes really picked up, and the growth rate has been anywhere from 4% to 6.2%. 2016 was our healthiest year in property tax growth. So it is our strongest revenue source right now, and it has been performing quite well.
Councilmember White?
Thank you. A couple questions. One is on Prop 8, what kind of, I mean, my gut feeling is that our property values are at least as high or around as high as they were at their peak. Was it 2007 or 6 or whatever the peak was? So I'm imagining that that recuperation, that's what it's about, right? Is trying to get back to that. So how long is that tail at this point? Do you have any sense of did they describe that to you, or did the assessor?
Committee Member White, we still have some room in that recapture. I don't recall how much room. I don't know if Mr. Samario remembers, but not all of the properties are back to their original assessed value from the peak. So we do still have some room, but off the top of my head, I don't recall how much room we have left. So we do have the ability to still, over the next couple of years, recapture additional temporarily reduced value from the recession.
And what's interesting is what they can recapture is, and I'll make up a number. Let's say in 2007, the value was $1 million, and it dropped substantially. They still track what they call the Prop 13 value. So they add every year to that year a CPI factor, 1 or 2%, depending whatever the CPI is, or 2%, whichever is lower. So by the time we get to 2015 or 16, that $1 million is now a $1.1 million, for example. So they can even recapture up to that point. They're not limited. So it's sort of they're chasing a growing number. But my instincts tell me that there's still a fair amount out there because I was just using Miss Neem as her own example, and she lives in Goleta, and she's still not all the way there. She's still got a fair amount of room to grow in terms of reassessments and property recapture.
Might we get just even a call to the assessor and just see if they have a plan on that?
Committee Member White, I actually do have that data. I just don't recall it off the top of my head, but I can get you that data.
Thank you. And then, secondly, was 2011 the only year that property taxes went down, or did 2010 go down as well?
I think 2011, Committee Member White, is the only year it went down. 2010, I believe, was like 0.1%. Okay. It was only 1 year that we saw a decline.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The next major revenue source I'll discuss is transient occupancy taxes. For FY16, we look at the projection based on actual results through February 2016. I do want to mention that the last 2 years, this has been one of our strongest revenue sources. We've seen double-digit growth over the last 2 years, but for FY16, it has slightly leveled off. So these projections are based on actual results through February 2016. As I mentioned, they've leveled off. For the first 8 months of the year, we did see 5 months of negative growth, only 3 months of positive growth. So we did reduce the growth rate from a 6% adopted growth rate to 4.7%. It's made up of two components, the first being hotels and motels, which has a 5% growth rate, and the second are short-term vacation rentals, which we are showing a 0% growth rate. In addition, we had the Santa Barbara Inn reopening in FY16. However, that's been delayed to 2017, so we pulled that out of the FY16 figures. We also added a wet weather adjustment in FY16 that originally wasn't in the adopted budget. We applied that for 2 months, a 5% adjustment. However, it's unknown whether or not that will impact those FY16 numbers at this time, but it is in there. Based on all of these changes to our assumptions in FY16, we do show a projected revenue decrease of $836,000 from adopted budget in FY16. As for FY17, we are showing a reduction in the growth rate from 6% to 3.7%, also made up of those two components, 4% for hotels and motels and 0% for short-term vacation rentals. We now have Santa Barbara Inn back in for the entire fiscal year. That is not included in that growth rate, so that is in addition to that 3.7% growth rate. We also are assuming the beginning of the phase-out of short-term vacation rentals. We have, in the second half of the fiscal year, a 20% reduction in short-term vacation rental revenues for the phase-out. So with all of these assumptions in FY17, we are showing a revised revenue forecast resulting in a $1.3 million decrease in revenues compared to the FY17 proposed budget. So this is a little small. I apologize. You may need to look at your handout. I apologize. This is a summary by month of all of the transient occupancy tax revenues. The only difference between some of the other charts I provided is it is monthly, and at the bottom in pink, you'll see a wet weather adjustment and a vacation rental phase out for 16 and 17. What you'll see here is that we have the results through February for actuals in FY16, and then that revised growth rate in FY16 of 4.7%. It results in an annualized growth rate with the wet weather adjustment of 1.7%. This results in a reduction in revenues compared to adopted budget for FY16 of about a little over $800,000. For FY17, we have the revised growth rate of 3.7%, but as I mentioned, with Santa Barbara Inn factored in, it does adjust that growth rate. We also have the phase out of the vacation rentals, so that results in an annualized growth rate of 4.7%, which impacts total revenues compared to FY17 proposed budget of about a loss of $1.3 million. Sorry for that size. I'll figure something out better for next time. So historical TOT revenues, as I mentioned, over the last couple of years, TOT revenues have performed quite well. In 2014 and 2015, it's been double-digit growth, 14% and 11%. In 2011, we had $12.5 million in TOT revenues, and in 2017, we're forecasting over $19 million, almost $20 million. It's an increase of over $7 million over that 7-year period, which is almost 60% growth. It's a pretty significant growth in a revenue source over 7 years. But what we're seeing is that it has leveled off in 2016. There could be, numerous contributing factors, potentially even environmental. So, but we are seeing it leveling off in 2016. Moving on to utility.
What do you mean by environmental?
Whether, Mr. Smart, I'm not sure how much I want to say, but we've talked about whether there was any potential impacts from environmental issues that occurred. Correct. Yes. Thank you. Moving on to utility users tax assumptions. In fiscal year 16, we have actual results through February 2016 that we used revised projections based on those actual results. We have utility users taxes are based on utilities such as telephone, cable, electric, natural gas. We are seeing several of those utilities come in below adopted budget, so we did reduce our overall growth rate from 3.5 to 0.2, but the individual growth rates vary. The largest decline we're seeing is in telephone. We're seeing consumers move away from traditional telephone landline service. We're seeing the biggest growth in water. However, we did see the passing of Assembly Bill 1717, which will implement the taxation of prepaid wireless, which actually started in January. However, we won't see all of the revenues coming in until September of 2016. They come in from different sources. From the big carriers such as Verizon and AT&T, they come in directly. But from the smaller carriers and the big box stores, they go through the Board of Equalization. And since we do not have any Costco's or Best Buys or big box carriers, we're not sure what the impact of those revenues will be yet. So in total, with these changes in our growth rates and what we're seeing in actual results, the projected revenue decrease in FY16 is $298,000.
So is the utility users tax that the Board of Equalization collects based on where the sales of the devices were, not on where the residence is?
Chair Hart, correct. It's where they sell the wireless cards.
Okay.
For FY17, we have reduced the overall growth rate from 3.5% to 2.2%. This is also, there's several different rates, and I'll show that on the next page with the chart. But we do show a full year of prepaid wireless in FY17, but as we are not completely sure what we're going to see in terms of prepaid wireless, we've been a little conservative. Also, we've been told that by our consultants that the Board of Equalization is stating that they'll have higher administrative costs related to the administration of prepaid wireless in the first 18 months. So we've built that into our forecast as well. Due to the lower base from FY16 and these reduced growth rates for the various utilities, the revised revenue forecast results in a $323,000 decrease in FY17. So this is a summary. Once again, this is a little small, I apologize, for FY16 and FY17. These are various rates for all of the utilities. And as I mentioned, water is performing well for both 16 and 17. We are projecting a higher growth rate in 17. But telephone for FY16 is down about 12%, a revised growth rate of 12%. For FY17, we revised it down to 2.2, even though we have increased the cellular by 6%. Overall, FY17, we've revised down from 3.5% growth rate to 2.2, which has an impact on revenues by about $320,000. FY16 was down about $290,000. I'm going to go over the last three major revenues briefly. Franchise fees, the revised projections are based on actual results through December as they are submitted quarterly as well. The franchise fees received through the first two quarters have been down a little bit, mostly due to natural gas. The original adopted growth rate was a negative 4.2%. Sorry, what did I say? Sorry, negative 14.2% due to the 1%, the litigation on the 1% additional franchise fee. We have increased that negative growth rate from negative 14.2% to negative 20.3%, primarily due to natural gas. Both the natural gas prices are down and demand is down and supply is up, which impacts prices. We are seeing this impact of natural gas also go on to FY17, so we've reduced that growth rate from 2% to 0.4%. So we're seeing a revised revenue forecast both in 16 and in 17, resulting in a decrease in revenues of $228,000 in 16 and $240,000 in 17. Yeah.
So we went through that kind of quick. So this year's adopted budget, as you can see, factored in a 14.2% reduction in franchise fee revenues. That was largely because of the fact that we were being challenged for that 1% that we added to electric franchise fees in early 2000, from 1% to 2%. We are still collecting that money, however. We're just putting that money aside and not treating it as revenue, so the money is being collected. And as you know, the case is going to be heard, hopefully, relatively soon by the Supreme Court. And if we end up coming out positive in that case, the money we have will then become one-time revenue that we've been accumulating. So it's not like we're not getting the money. We're just not treating it as revenue. We're putting it into a liability account. So, but we planned on, the potential that we would lose and have to repay that money, and that's why we're not treating it as revenue, and that's what's the 14.2% decline in revenue for 16.
How much has accumulated in that account?
Chair Hart, it's budgeted around $700,000, and to date, I believe we received a little over $300,000. Moving on to business license, we are revising our projection based on actual results through February of 2016. The revised growth rate has been reduced from 1% to a negative 0.6%. We are seeing a reduction in new licensing for FY16, and we believe that will carry on through FY17. We're continuing to see a reduction in new licensing. So we've reduced our growth rate from 1% to a negative 2.7% in FY17 as well. So the revised revenue forecast results in a $66,000 decrease in FY16 and a $189,000 decrease in FY17. And lastly, property transfer tax. Just in case you're not familiar with what this is, what it is it's $1.10 for every 1,000 assessed value when a property is sold, and the city gets 50% of that. And basically what that means is anytime a property is sold, they take that amount for what the value of that sale and give us half of that. What it means is it's really difficult to estimate that. One large sale can mean the entire budget for the whole year. And what we saw is that there was a very significant sale in July of this year, and it met, I believe, over half of our budget just in that one sale. So it's hard to estimate that. What we did is we looked at a 10-year average, and that's how we estimated our growth for FY16 and FY17. So we're recommending no change in the growth rate of 3% for FY16 and FY17 because of that one large sale in July of 2015. It results in additional revenues beyond adopted budget for FY16 and FY17 just from that one sale. So that's why you see an additional $97,000 in FY16, which increases the base for FY17 and results in another $100,000 in revenues in FY17. So in summary, these are those three revenues we just discussed, including our assumptions. You'll see this is slightly different than the other one we provided because it's in a different format. But FY15 is in yellow, FY16 is in orange, and it has the adopted budget, the reforecast, the revised growth, and then the variance is in the orange column. And in green is the FY17 budget, which has the proposed growth, the reforecast, the revised growth, and then the variance to the proposed budget is in green. So what you'll see here is the franchise fees and the business license are both showing a little bit below the adopted budget and the original proposed budget, whereas the property transfer tax, as I just mentioned, is coming in a little bit higher due to that one very large sale, and then that changes the base for FY17, which results in slightly higher revenues. For these three revenues together, which they're not related, I'm just showing them together, but if you look at them all together, in net, we're showing a variance between the adopted budget and the reforecast of 197 reduction in revenues for FY16 and 329,000 reduction between the original proposed budget in FY17 and the reforecast. And that is my presentation today. I'm happy to answer any questions before I pass it off to Mr. Samario to go over the multi-year forecast.
Are there any questions for Ms. Nemes? I had one question. Back to the franchise fees and the litigation exposure. The case would actually go back in time and penalize for the amount of money that has been collected previously. So the liability account that you have created this year is just for 1 year. We have that exposure of all of those years. What is the total amount of that potentially?
I don't recall, Mr. Chair, how far back, but it's definitely several years. I think it's at least 3 years that we have exposure on.
Okay. So it's in the neighborhood of
$2.5 million, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, then Mr. Samario, continue. Thank you, Ms. Neves.
Thank you. So before I get into my portion, I wanted to remind everybody that when we adopted the budget in 2016 and the proposed budget for 17, each of those years we had budgeted surpluses. We were hoping that we were planning, in fact, using those surpluses to help restore our reserves, which at the time we were developing the tier plan, were still below policy. As you know, we've gotten to the policy reserves at the end of last year, 15. But the surpluses would have been nice to have had into either more services, more capital, or more reserves. Those surpluses are gone because we saw a $2.5 million impact just in 16 or 17 alone, so we know that all that surplus went away. We were fortunate when we did a reforecast of the expenditures side, and we mentioned this before because of all the turnover in staff, that people who leave or retire at the top step, when we reforecast them where they're filled, they're always typically filled at the lower step. So just that process, the turnover in staff we've seen, particularly police and other areas, saved us over $1 million. So that helped us close that gap from the revenue impact. So we used the surplus, the savings on the expenditure side to really offset the revenue impacts. But in any case, I wanted to sort of show you a summary, and because I'm going to be showing you what it's kind of looking like over next year as well, in 2018. So 16, 17, and 18, all essentially we're projecting where we're going to be. And so Ms. Nemes talked about these 5 revenue sources. These are the key revenues that we have in the general fund. And I wanted to show you what we're forecasting, at least in my forecast for 18, to give you some context. So we believe that property taxes are still going to remain strong. There's that property recapture. So I'm assuming that we're going to be at 4.9% as we're assuming for 17. For sales taxes, and Ms. Nemes mentioned this, it's in light of what we're at today, 3% seems a little aggressive. We're hoping that CPI does recover. Gas prices being stabilized, going up a little bit, will help achieve that. And I'm assuming that for 18 as well. For bed taxes, TOT, Ms. Nemes mentioned that the real base that we're looking at is the 3.7%. And we added more to that because of other factors with the Santa Barbara Inn coming online. But I was fairly optimistic, and I used a 4.8% TOT growth for 2018. And then for utility users tax, I just kept it at 2%, which I think is about a CPI, and same with franchise fees. That's a very tough one to forecast, as we mentioned. But I thought 2% for just looking ahead and forecasting out, isn't a bad number to use. And so overall, I'm assuming that just in these revenues that we're going to grow 4%. And that's probably not unrealistic, historically at least, but who knows what the next couple of years is going to bring. On the expenditure side, I thought it was important for us to show you how these costs have changed and how we're forecasting them over the next year or two. So clearly in the general fund, our biggest expense are the salaries and benefits, and I identified salaries as a single line item And what we're expecting that to grow by over a 2-year period. So starting with the adopted budget into the recommended budget, which is before you, and then the forecast based, and we have a payroll forecast system that helps us based on when contracts expire. And as you know, we have assumed a 3% growth rate for salaries for all expiring, beyond expiring MOU. So that's factored in this number. So between 16 and 18, salaries will grow about $7 million, or about 11.4%. Group insurance is actually fairly stable because as these premiums go up, and it depends on the bargain unit, but a lot of the costs end up being borne by the employee because we have caps. And the city will pay up to a certain amount, but then once we hit a certain cap, then it's on the employee. And so that's what we're seeing reflected here, that only a 5.4% growth over a few years, because most of that is because we're assuming about a 10% growth per year, that will then be borne by the employee. The biggest benefit cost we have is on retirement. These are the city's contributions, the city's share, not the employee share. There's the city's share of retirement costs for all of our employees, public safety and non-safety. And this year, the adopted budget is $17.5 million. By 2018, we're forecasting that to be $21.3 million, with a growth of 22.2% overall, $3.9 million, more than half of the salary growth, because even though it's a much smaller number, because the percentage growth is going to be higher. This is really two factors that are at play. One is the fact that salaries are going up, so we know that retirement costs are going to go up by the same amount. So if we have a 3% increase in salaries, then we know retirement costs are going to go up by 3%. But what's also in play here is the fact that we've talked about this 5-year plan to increase rates to help undo what happened in 2008 and 9 with the recession on PERS assets. So this is really reflecting the fact that salaries are going up, but the bigger impact is the fact that retirement rates and our contribution rates are going up much more than that. So any questions on this slide? This is part of the forecast as well on the expenditure side. Okay.
So why does the salary increases from FY16 to 17, why are those more than 3%?
There are other things that are factored in there, merit increases. So we know that there are folks in the bottom of the range. That's why we saw some savings this past year. But as people move up with time, we know they go up 5% per year. So that reflects that increases from a merit-based salary increase.
Then that isn't offset by people who retire and are replaced by people that are entering at the entry level stage?
We don't factor that into the forecast. We don't factor sort of the turnover. We say, okay, who's in position today, and we forecast and we factor in merit increases over time based on where they're at in the salary range. But we don't factor in any vacancy rate based on that. That's the anticipated year in variance we budget on the revenue side of what we expect to save from people leaving and having vacancies.
So this is more conservative on the expense side, and that gets recaptured in the year end.
Yes, that's a fair way to say it.
Because it looks strikingly large in comparison and presented this way. And,
Right.
and it sounds like you're counting it on the extra expense side from the merit increases, but you're not subtracting the turnover
Right.
salary benefit.
That's correct.
Okay.
A comment then, Mr. Chair. And that is the retirement number obviously is very large. And I know that I remain curious about the sort of the life cycle of it, where an employee that retired recently, just a contemporary instance. And obviously the questions I've asked for general information on this speak to that as well. But how much money did an employee contribute during that career? How much money did the jurisdiction contribute to that career? And then how does that play out during an actuarial lifespan? I think that it's something that I'd like to see sometime. It would give people an insight into the situation, our conundrum, and obviously there was the big increase that happened about, was it 15 years ago or something like that, where the benefits were increased without with the thought that the full funding would continue. But we're paying that piper now with that 22% increase and a number of $21 million. That's a big number out there. And anticipated, we got three more years in that 5-year deal. So these kinds of increases we can look forward to going out for several more years, and it's a painful number. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Of course, it all is in context, and the reality is that there were many years where we didn't have to pay anything into PERS because with the fund, the actual aerial tables were the other way, and that there were surpluses being generated in the fund. So at any given moment in time, when you take a snapshot and you look at the increases, which are serious and significant and a cause for concern, you have to recognize too that there was a period of time when PERS didn't charge the city enough for, and we wouldn't be paying this today had that occurred. And hindsight is 50-50 or 20-20, whatever it is.
I mean, that's a good point, because I know that under PEPRA, what PERS can no longer do is have these holidays or rate holidays. They have to charge at least the normal cost, even if they're having surpluses, because to avoid things like that. So we have a schedule. I'm not sure if it's next week, but if not, it's the week after. We're going to bring back the information based on the questions you asked. So I think we have most of that available. And we can try to bring back the response to the question you just asked about what's the, if you look at the total amount needed to fund a pension, how much of that comes from the employee, the employer, or interest earnings. I'll tell you that in gross terms, about 2/3 of the pension is funded from accumulated earnings. It's a powerful number. That's why the 7.5% number is such an important number. It creates volatility, but it's what helps to keep rates relatively low, or at least lower than they otherwise would be if we were using a 5% or 6% assumed rate of return. And then you can just think about what portion is the employee paying versus the city. To help you, the remaining third, how much of that would be paid by the employee versus an employer.
Yeah, and I think my worry is that I worry that number one that a current taxpayer is funding a previous employee's, an already retired person's pension. And I also worry that a current employee is funding a past an existing retiree's pension. Those are two. I don't know whether those actually occur or not, but those are worries of mine.
Well, theoretically, it does work that way, so that somebody who's employed for 30 years, the idea is that by the time they retire, the assets that are needed to fund their pension will be accumulated the day they retire. We know that there's volatility in between that, and maybe they're at the time that they retire, they're in their particular account, they're under because they had a bad couple of years just before then. But the theory is that the taxpayers and the pensions are being funded during their time of employment. What happens is when we have the changes in benefits in the early 2000s, where employees got an immediate impact and the increase to the benefit, but had been working 20 years before that and retired 5 years later, that's where we see the unfunded liabilities created, that where taxpayers are paying for retired folks that didn't fully fund their pension by the time they retire. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, of course, we're reading about this all over the world, where pensions are an issue just in every jurisdiction. And as I say, in trying to get my head around it, those are two places where I think that the fairness issue comes to mind. Is it fair that the subsidies are occurring in a certain way? And I'm just trying to get not only my head around it, but provide information to our constituents so they get a sense of how we got here and why we're looking at numbers like in the midst of a flat year. This is a year when our revenues aren't doing that well, and yet this expense is coming in at a very bad number, and it aggravates. If we had another 10% increase in revenue year, then this disappears more than in a year when we see a sag, and obviously we're struggling with our other investment needs. Thank you.
And I guess just to comment, every year I've been on the council, you've asked these questions, and I'm perfectly willing to go through this again. I don't understand what it actually has to do with our deliberations about the budget, though, because I must say that it is what it is. It is the requirement that we have to make per state law to continue to participate in the PERS pension system. It's a political point, I guess, to make.
Exactly.
And but I don't know why that. Are you proposing that we don't participate in the PERS retirement system as a way to control those costs? What exactly is the decision point that you're proposing for us here?
It could be even something that goes on the legislative agenda, saying, I mean, why we have the improvements that we have may even partially come out of local jurisdictions experiencing pain, and saying, you know, this is hurting us too much, so legislature help us, and legislature comes out with PEPRA as an example that those reforms have occurred so far. There are more. There is in the future still yet another increase in employee participation, which can occur. Mm-hmm. So those are pieces. Mm-hmm. And yet, even with those, we're seeing numbers like 22% increase. Mm-hmm. So we can continue to say, this still isn't, I mean, and at the same time, our revenues are getting whittled away, the utilities tax, the sales tax. And obviously the conversation around infrastructure and streets, these are all pieces that are, the locals are the ones confronting these issues. We're the ones where the rubber meets the road, mm-hmm. So et cetera. So for us to be able to communicate back up to the state and say, this still isn't working properly, we're still having a 5% drop in revenues and a 22% increase in retirement funds, let's just say this happens again and again. That squeeze cannot be indefinite, as you well know. And so that's my point, is to just be able to, and also to put it in a way that people can understand, that I can understand anyway. And obviously, PERS is I think you're all in. We're all in with PERS. That's just, there isn't it's a punitive, to get out of PERS is a punitive process at this point. So I do not propose that.
Well, that's why I keep. Well, I think it does. You know, it highlights what you're trying to do, I guess. But what we're trying to do here is to actually figure out how to deal with it. And it seems like it'd be more productive to focus in on the pieces of this puzzle that we are in control of, rather than the parts that we're not. And in that sense, if you're looking at these numbers, you know, the obvious thing that we are in control of is the salaries and the rate of and the number of employees that we have. I mean, True. What we actually could be talking about is a hiring freeze that would have a significant impact on a number that we control on this sheet of paper, as opposed to having a conversation about what the state legislature should do about PERS that we have no effect over. And I just think that would be more productive for us to spend our time on.
Well, and I agree that we should spend our time doing that as well. I think to understand, hopefully, I mean, that's why we're bumping up our time on Finance Committee to meeting at noon. It's like the infrastructure issue. These are big questions that need a lot of attention. And so I appreciate that this is the first comment that I've heard about hiring freeze, and I appreciate you bringing it up. And I look forward to having, if that's something that you're suggesting to look at, I look forward to learning more about it.
I've only suggested in the sense that there are things on this one chart that we control, and that's the one thing that we control. We don't control the workers' compensation rates. We don't control the retirement rates. We don't control the group insurance rates. We don't control other benefits. We control salaries. And the whole point of this chart that shows that our key expenditure growth over the next 3 years is going to increase by 12.6%, and our revenues are going to increase by 4%, is to point out that that is not a sustainable path.
Exactly.
And I don't know that having a conversation about the pieces that we don't control is productive or helpful in our conversation.
Well, I would hope that we would be able to have a rich conversation on all of those things, and I appreciate the points you're making about the things we can control. We should definitely need to look at closely, and I look forward to that.
Okay. Councilmember Dominguez?
I wanted to ask about the workers' comp. Can you speak a little more?
Sure. So the workers' comp number is a number that gets allocated out of our self-insurance fund. You know, our self-insurance program or fund manages our workers' comp program, our liability program, as well as occupational safety and health. So the number has actually been seemingly stable, although if you look at 15, it's a much lower number. We intentionally budgeted more money being charged to the general fund as well as all the enterprise funds because we've seen an uptick in primarily the magnitude of the workers' comp claims over the last few years. And as a result of that, the actuaries that we have a study every couple of years, they tell us that we need to have more money in reserves to fund those claims that are either filed, outstanding, or potential. And a lot of it is statistics, but so they've told us we need more money, and we are basically underfunded in that self-insurance fund. So that workers' comp number is the general fund's portion of the premiums that we've charged to them to help pay for their share, the general fund's share, which includes police, fire, recreation, public works, and the like, of the costs associated with the workers' comp program. We are, self-insured up to $750,000, and they have excess insurance above that. But that's what that charge is. That's the general fund's total portion for their share of the costs associated with the workers' comp program and the rising costs that we've seen over the last few years.
So then does this money go into a reserve?
It does, essentially does. It goes into the self-insurance fund, and we accumulate it in a reserve based on what the actuaries tell us we're supposed to have. And like I said, we are underfunded in that fund by a couple $1 million. When you look at how much money we have versus what the actuaries say we're supposed to have, instead of $7 million, we have $5 million, for example.
So does this mean we're not then paying a couple million a year in workers' comp fees or penalties or costs?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means that, again, it's just, every year, or every couple of years, the actuaries say, how much money should you have in the bank in order to pay the claims that are going to be paid over many years? It's an accrued liability number.
Okay, so if we reduce workplace injuries, presumably that number will follow. There's a little bit of a lag
over time. We'll see the actuaries start to reduce the reserve requirements, and assuming we see a reduction in the number of claims as well.
Okay. And that's something, obviously, I think everyone would agree we can try to work on reducing workplace injuries. So that's something that I'd love to talk about more in the budget process. Going back to the salaries and the pension, those numbers are big in both absolute terms and growth terms. And I'd love to see us do both, working on the salary numbers and if we can do any kind of lobbying. I know we're in an election year, so anything's possible, and we've seen some pretty crazy stuff happen statewide and nationwide. And I know the state is in this weird electoral, point in time where a lot of the assembly people and senators around the state are at the beginning of their terms in terms of term limits. So we're going to have an unprecedented California government in the sense that we're going to have a lot of people in Sacramento for a long period of time, just the way the timing worked out. So who knows, maybe there's a chance we can get them to work on CalPERS. And going back to if there was a period where we weren't paying in as much, maybe we can now use that lesson and set something aside or somehow deal with a potential shortfall in the future. I know there's not a lot we can do because we've already got pretty big reserves and we've got ongoing operational costs that wouldn't really make sense, especially with our infrastructure where it is now. But if there's something that we can consider kind of outside the box, I'd love to hear suggestions from staff on that. Not necessarily today, but that's more of a long-term discussion, depending on what Sacramento is going to do. The governor with PERPRA did a pretty big refinement of the system. So if there's something we can do with enhanced legislation down the line, I'd be glad to talk to some legislators or brainstorm with staff.
Mr. Smart, you want to continue
Sure,
with the
sure.
presentation?
So, and I probably should have said this at the outset. We used to do multi-year forecasts. I remember I've done them, and I used to go out a couple years. So you would normally see a 2019 number, even a 2020 number, and sometimes serves as a disservice because you're making a lot of assumptions in order to come up with those numbers, and then you get too many assumptions, and who knows, the numbers lose their validity. So I look out 1 year, but even still, that's still a ways from now. We kind of take things from a budget perspective 1 year at a time, but we do these forecasts to see, are there any unusual trends, something we should start watching for. And I think that the context of this is not so much what are we going to be doing today to develop next year's budget and all that, or making any tweaks, but it's kind of looking longer term and what are the kind of things that could impact. And of course, we're going to be entering into a lot of labor negotiations. That's where I see that this maybe is relevant. Is sort of let's keep in mind where the trend is right now. We could see revenues do much better than we thought, and we could see these expenditures do better than we think. Not sure, but that's kind of the purpose we bring this to you, is just to kind of get a sense of what's the next 2 years looking like. So a lot of detail that goes into this. We have the multi-year forecast document is a line item document, but this is a summary of the revenues and expenditures. So let's start with 16. This is what we're projecting this year based on the numbers that Ms. Nemes just went over, the revenues and then the expenditure side. And so this year we are projecting that we're going to be generating a surplus of $3.4 million. A lot of that is because, not just because even though revenues are going down, but we're going to expect to see a fair amount of savings this year on the expenditure side. We still have a lot of vacancies in the police. We're going to see them going to the academy soon, but we're still seeing across the board a lot of vacancies. We don't expect that to carry over to next year. But this year we're expecting a $3.4 million operating surplus. $1 million of that, or $1.1 million, is going to go to capital. That's per the budget. And so we are left with a net increase to reserves of $2.3 million. And then pursuant to council direction, and this is something we're going to have to talk about when we get to year end, because the whole idea was that we wanted to only allocate 25% to capital, 75% to the operating reserves, because we weren't expecting to be fully funded at last year. So we can revisit this, and at the end of this year we can go back to the normal policy of 50%. So that would add a little more money to capital, and then we're still above policy and reserves. For next year, of course, we have a balanced budget we're proposing. We're not budgeting any surplus. We're expecting our revenues are going to match our expenditures. In fact, we had to do a little bit of balancing it in order to make that happen. So our operating surplus is going to be exactly equal to what we need to cover our capital program. For 2018, and again, there's those caveats that we're making forecasts and assumptions, and you saw the assumptions I used in the revenue side. We're expecting that we're going to have an operating surplus and actually a deficit of $231,000. Essentially, the trends, when you see the expenditure line, as Mr. Chairman Hart mentioned, the relative growth on the revenue side versus the expenditure side, or vice versa, it's just causing the lines to go apart. And in 2018, it's only causing it to go apart slightly to the tune of $231,000 to the negative. But we still have a capital program we have to fund, and we're planning on funding at $1.45 million. So we are seeing in 18, at least based on what we know today, that we would have a reduction in the reserve balances of $1.7 million if all things held true. Looking at what the reserve numbers would look like, at the end of this year, we would actually expect to be slightly below reserves by about $1 million. It's not bad. Again, we could still do better than that this year. Next year, assuming that we are balanced and everything comes in as planned, then we would actually be slightly above reserve policy. So the next 2 years, we're essentially still fully funded, if you think about it that way. And let me make sure I misspoke. The numbers are reversed. So in 2017, we would expect to be $364,000 under budget, under reserve policy. So the actual policies in 17 would be at $32.4 million. We're supposed to have $32.75 million. So that should be a negative number. So we would be expected to be below policy reserves by the end of next year. So at the end of next year. But that's really just, that's the margin of error, and anything can turn and make that even. It's an 18 where we see more problem, and that's where we see those lines really diverge. And remember the dynamics that occur. One is that as the budget grows, or so do our policy requirements. So we're having to chase that number. And I want to, in fact, go back to this. If you look at least on a forecast basis, the operating expenditures are going to grow from a $125.6 million next year to $131 million in 2018. That's the combination of salaries, benefits, and all those things. So, to the $6 million increase or $5.5 million increase puts about $1.25 million into what we're supposed to have in reserves. So we're chasing that bigger number. And then the fact that we're expecting to have a deficit of $1.7 million in 2018, that causes us to be below policy. And again, that should be a negative number. I apologize. By $3.7 million. That's just, looking out, big picture. The number is going to be something different, but it's, trying to establish an order of magnitude. Any questions on this?
Councilmember Dominguez.
I think I may have gotten a little bit lost in that last part. So the reserves in 2018, that'll be a negative number, the $3,684,000.
Right. So we would be below policy reserves. So the top section is what we're projecting we're going to actually have in reserves. The bottom section is what our reserve requirements are. And again, they grow every year. And then the comparison is the bottom row between what we should have and what we expect to have. And all those numbers at the bottom should be negative.
So it looks like half of that's the 1.681.
Right.
And then what would be the other 2 million?
The fact that the policy requirements go up every year because of the expenditure budget or the budget grows. So again, I look at it this way: for every $4 million in growth in the expenditure side, we need $1 million in surplus just to stay even.
And it looks like the disaster reserve grows $1 million, and that's driven by the total budget as well. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, it's 25 and 10, is that right?
It's 15 and 10. 15 for disasters and 10 for contingencies.
And 10% are the two numbers that travel with the budget for reserves.
Okay. And this is just a pictorial of what we just went over, so you can see the history of the reserve starting back in 2005. In 16 and 15 should be matched for the actual reserves, but 16 were there, of course. 17 we're going to be slightly below, but it's when 18, if all things hold true, as I said, and again, we're just looking out a year or two, that's when we'd see the gap in reserves occur based on the current trajectory of revenues and expenditures. That concludes our report. Again, I'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Samara. Any questions? Any comments? Councilmember White?
Thank you. It's a mixture of question and comment, and that is the one that feels the most tenuous to me, and I know that we've talked about this in the past, is the sales tax number coming out of the internet, and just watching that I know you're watching that very carefully, and just that forecast feels optimistic, and I of course they say hope for the best and plan for the worst, and I know that you'll quarter by quarter, and there's a little more of a lead time on sales tax as well, that we get information for several. Is it a couple of quarters back or something like that? So
right.
Our course corrections are late. So maybe talk about that a little bit. Again, I know that your folks are tuned into it, but that would be helpful to be, guiding us as we do this quarter by quarter.
And I agree that the 3% is probably a little optimistic, but I think that we were a little conservative, and we were just talking about this before the meeting. We think we're a little bit conservative on the property tax side, so we think that we sort of hedged our bets there. But it's hopefully we'll see those two materialize and better results on property taxes. But if we weren't being somewhat conservative on the property tax side, we might have dropped that sales tax number to 2% for 17.
Uh-huh. And then my question is on the planning review fees. That I remember seeing. There's a big book of fees that that is in a package somewhere that we get to review, and as I think I've talked about in the past, I think of the planning review fees are a significant subsidy and therefore a significant deficit area where we provide services and we collect money for it, but we don't collect as much as it's costing us
Right.
to provide those services. When does that discussion occur?
Committee Member White, next week we'll be bringing back general fund fees, and based on the question you asked, we're going to, folks from the planning division are going to speak to that question.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
So is there any direction to staff to come to project a different sales tax rate for the budget? Are you looking for that?
I'm asking for what I know they're going to be doing anyway, which is watching it very closely, and if there's any variation from your forecast, that we hear about it as soon as you can. And I know you're going to be doing that anyway. We all want this to be not just optimistic, but right.
Right.
Councilmember Dominguez?
And it sounds like there's a lot of factors you took into account with the sales tax, and those are beyond my scope. But I was kind of curious how statewide spending or sales tax trends look, and people have talked about online purchases taking a bite into sales tax. I'm wondering if there's some legislation taking place to try to redistribute that tax, if those might have an impact or.
Committee Member Dominguez, so it's a complicated question. They are looking at currently how sales taxes are distributed. I know that the city of Tracy right now is arguing with the State Board of Equalization so that they get all of the sales taxes collected by Amazon from their facility. Right now it goes into a county pool based on where the person purchased that product. So we get at least a piece of that. But there's no proposed change. They're not talking about anything major in terms of how things are collected. The internet piece is complicated, but at least for the moment, we know that if you buy something from your home and you live in Santa Barbara through the internet, if sales taxes are collected, we do get a piece of that. It's in proportion to what all other sales taxes are in the county. But we believe that if there's going to be legislation, it'll be requiring folks like Amazon to do a better job of exactly indicating, where are they buying it from? Where's the delivery point? So instead of point of sale, point of delivery, that should be the basis upon where the sales taxes go. So if you're at home and you don't share that anymore, it comes directly to the city of Santa Barbara in its entirety for our share. So I know they're working on those kind of things, but it's a complicated issue. So I'm not sure that's responsive, but
It's complicated from an accounting point of view or from a political point of view, or both?
Both. Because, really it means that there are winners and losers. And then, so that makes it tough.
And one other comment, sure.
We also have members of the public, too, that I think want to speak. Any questions or comments from members of the public?
Thank you, John Campanella. Just a question. I'm seeing a situation a little bit when you analyze, let's say, a shopping center company or something. You talk about same-store sales or new growth, and I don't know how much in the forecast is same-store sales, let's say, with changes in economics versus the addition of some new stores in the mix. So I don't know how much, like on the horizon where we see additional units or commercial or hotel development, how much of that plays in to the forecast. I would think it would be important in that maybe this is a little bit of a cushion if we look at what's coming online over the next couple of years. It may only be a couple of percentage points, 2 to 4, let's say. But what could happen is as the property tax catch-up starts to wear off over the next 1, 2, or 3 years, perhaps the new property taxes at today's value comes in and can help offset that a bit. As far as sales taxes, there's internet sales, but seeing for my kids, there's also things that are almost like bartering. You actually contact each other and buy used rather than buy new. So perhaps the new residents at some higher, at somewhat higher than median income that'll be here would start generating the sales taxes around town that might offset that trend as well as we go forward. And then the last one might be the TOT tax, where new hotels coming online, the capacity might be able to generate more TOT during the good weather that may offset if we get more rainy days and that impact that would have on the existing. So I don't know if that's in the forecasting or maybe if there's a pro forma nugget that somebody can do, let's say 3 years out, if assuming what's in the pipeline comes to fruition, what would that be adding to those components, or an estimate of that? So at least we know maybe there's a cushion out there that's coming up that could help offset some of the unknowns that might exist on the current basis for sales tax, property tax, and TOT. Just a thought.
Mr. Mario, do you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chair, committee members, we do look at that kind of data. For example, when we get our reports from our sales tax consultants, we know which businesses have gone out of business, and so we have to factor that in to the following years. And likewise, if we see new business that's generating a little bit of sales tax because they've only been in business for a month, we factor that into the sort of our forecast. Same with TOT. As you know, we factored in the Santa Barbara Inn coming back online. If we know of hotels in the future, we factor that in. In fact, my forecast assumes some growth because of La Entrada on the TOT side for N18, because we're expecting that to be at least, if not all, most of 2018. So we definitely look at those kinds of things.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I have a comment.
Councilmember White?
Thank you. As we look at all these numbers, we see the surprises out there, and sort of the surprises were that some things went flat a little. The revenues went flatter than anticipated in several areas, and thank goodness our staff is looking at this carefully and trying to look ahead and be prepared for keeping our knees bent for this. This was what happened with the crash. The staff was prepared better than most jurisdictions to handle that, even though our reserves had been depleted, and so that was really an excellent move made there. Going forward, we're seeing out there a deficit, and that Mr. Dominguez and I have put something on the council agenda to look at development impact fees as a possibility for which could generate a modest sum, but that could help those deficits out sometime in that time frame. So. And then, as I mentioned, obviously, I look forward to hearing the conversation or participating in the conversation about the development review fees as well. Thank you.
So the item that you and Councilman Dominguez put on the agenda, on the future council agenda, is development fees? I thought it was
it's two things.
An AUD revision.
It's looking at AUD and looking at development impact fees.
And when is that scheduled for the council?
I don't know. I don't think it's been scheduled yet. And I encourage you to, since these are important conversations, I encourage you to encourage staff to get that on sooner than later.
Well, it certainly needs to be on in a time frame that relates to this budget if you're proposing to do something.
Well, this is just policy to work on, and when it clicks in, there's obviously processes of implementing these that could take a while. So. But let's have the conversation and see whether we have a meeting of the minds on a variety of these things, and then make progress from there.
And I guess the only thing that I would comment on is that I think that the disconnect between revenues and expenditures in relation to salaries and benefits is pointing directly toward a hiring chill, which is what you have done this year to balance the budget. In a small way, and it seems like that strategy is the most immediate tool that's available to get things closer in balance, because it has a long-term cumulative effect. The sooner you do it rather than later, and that's obviously a tension between current services and future costs. And I think that's a productive place for the Finance Committee to talk about. So it would be useful to have some sort of estimate of what that could look like in different phases and different forms. There's the $300,000 that you propose to save this year with a hiring chill, which I understand was just a matter of not filling vacancies as quickly as would otherwise be the case. A variation on that would extend that longer and save more, potentially even have a hiring freeze. Those different levels and increments of potential savings would be good for us to look at, particularly in relation to that fiscal year 18 shortfall with the reserve levels.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, be assured that we are going to be looking at our revenues every month, very closely every quarter, And if we start to see, even worse trends, and then we're gonna react, and it'll either be part of the adopted budget, or it's part of first quarter or mid-year next year. We're not going to wait to the end of the year to make suggestions. So if we see revenues start to tank even more, or do something worse than we expected, then we will come back to you with some recommended suggestions about how we address that, rather than waiting too long. And that's been we've done well, is being quick to react, to make course corrections when we see those kinds of trends.
Okay. With that, I think we're adjourned. Thank you.